This week on Silicon Reel, we have Stephany, CEO of JustPark and author of the book, The Business of Sharing.
JustPark is like Airbnb without washing sheets. The sharing economy is really a human economy. This is an economy in which people are getting goods and services, not from multinationals or from governments, but from usually just ordinary people. This is about efficiency. So the sharing economy is adding value because it's finding these efficiencies on both sides of the marketplace. And that's why really this is just the start of a huge, huge trend. Okay, so it'll be absolutely second nature to get a good or service from another person. So you will no longer think of that as a quirky or unusual thing. That will just be part of your daily routine. Yeah. But London is this astonishing magnet for talent and entrepreneurship and ideas and ambition.
Silicon Reel presents Stephany, The Business of Sharing.
This is one of the really challenging things about the sharing economy. It's generally very, very good for consumers, but it can be really bad for some of the service providers.
Okay, here we go. I wanted to welcome everyone watching us now live on YouTube. It's Good Friday, and we're still here to entertain you with a fabulous story. So let's get going. This is Silicon Reel, the weekly talk show dedicated to the people of the London technology startup scene. My guest today is Stephany, who is the CEO of JustPark, the world's largest website for shared parking with over 1 million customers.
Almost. 750,000.
There you go. You guys are backed by Index Ventures and the VC arm of BMW. You also just completed the largest ever equity crowdfunding round in 2015, £3.7 million, which is the legal EU max, from over 2,900 investors. Alex, you were educated at Oxford University. You're a mentor at Techstars, and you just wrote a book called The Business of Sharing. I was at your launch party. It was fabulous. Welcome to Silicon Reel.
Thank you very much for having me, Brian. It's very awesome to be here.
It's a pleasure. You know, every time we start talking, we just keep talking, because when I'm making a short video of you, like at your launch party or like we did just now, there's just so many things to talk about because you're in the middle of the sharing economy, and you just wrote a really detailed book about the sharing economy as well. And we also have a bunch of other things to talk about, like the big crowdfunding campaign. I don't know where to start, but I'm just going to jump in.
Yeah, sure.
I was reading your book, and it's really good, and it's really packed. You said 80,000 words is what it ended up being. Is that right? Which is a healthy book, but it starts off, you're in San Francisco, you're getting a ride at Lyft, and the guy starts talking to you. He knows you're a Brit, and it's a real dive into the sharing economy and what it means and how it's going to change everything. I bet most people watching us have used Airbnb or used Uber, but I don't think we really understand like a lot of the ramifications of the sharing economy. And with JustPark, like the more I now mention you and the company, so many of my friends have used JustPark, and so it's really strange in that sense, is I don't think I've ever been touched by a company and then found out that everyone's actually using it. So I don't know where to start, but where should we start? You know?
Well, I got an Uber here today, and I had a similar experience. This doesn't happen every hour, every day, far from it. But I was talking to the guy, and he said, "Hey, what do you do?" And I said, "I actually run a company called JustPark." And then he kind of leapt out of his seat and said, "Hey, I downloaded that app this morning." I was like, "Really?" He's like, "You serious?" I said, "Yeah." So we had a little chat about that. And that was a kind of nice sharing economy story in itself. Yeah. So this guy was an aspiring actor, and he was able to have the flexibility to go to auditions by being self-employed and becoming this sort of micro entrepreneur as an Uber driver. And he wouldn't have been able to do that. 5 years ago, he would have had to go to a mini cab company and probably had much worse working conditions and very fixed hours, and he would have had to crawl his way up, and it wouldn't have been meritocratic. Right. But he was there making cash, and it wasn't his dream to be an Uber driver, but it was his dream to become a famous actor. And that was allowing him to achieve that.
Right. So it's not just a business model. It really changes people's lives and changes the choices they can make just by being able to share in a real frictionless way. Is that right? Absolutely.
I mean, I don't like business books. It's a bit of a confession. It's something that I feel I should like because I work in the business world, but so rarely will I buy and enjoy a business book. And so when Macmillan came to me and said, "Hey, do you want to write a business book?" my instinctive answer was, not really. I think the world has enough business books. But then I thought more about it, and I realized that this was kind of the anti-business book, because the sharing economy is really a human economy. This is an economy in which people are getting goods and services, not from multinationals or from governments, but from usually just ordinary people. And so that I felt was a story that needed to be told. And the other thing that I feel I've been able to bring to this story is what it's like to actually work inside this industry. So nothing has really ever been written on this subject more than a blog here or there by someone running a sharing economy company. And so that's been great because I can use my own network to interview people like co-founders of Airbnb or Zipcar or VCs like Fred Wilson in New York or Alfred Lin at Sequoia. And I can also, I kind of have an inside view, I guess, on the challenges of working in this economy and growing a business within this new economy as well.
Let's hear about your story quickly. You used to be a lawyer at a major firm here in London, and at some point you decided to stop doing that, and then you got, and you're now the CEO of JustPark. Can you just tell me a little bit about that transition?
Yeah. Okay, well, I was a really bad lawyer. That's probably the first place to start.
First time I heard that.
Yeah, and which now I'm sort of like, let's get an in-house lawyer because I should not be doing law for JustPark. I was a pretty average lawyer, but I could see that I had skills that other people in this corporate law firm didn't have. And I felt like I was in the wrong job. After 2 or 3 weeks, I thought, okay, I can kind of do this at a push, but it's not really playing to my strengths. So I was really working out how I can get myself out of that law firm. And I think the whole time I just was thinking I wanted to basically be forced to find a new direction. And so after the 2 years that expired, which was the initial contract, the vast majority of people in my cohort at that law firm got taken on and got placed into departments and began to move up the profession and so on. Right. And this was 2009, and it's sort of deep financial crisis, deep pessimism about the global economy. And they said, hey, Alex, we're not going to make you an offer. So kind of shake hands and good luck type thing, which was upsetting and felt like a bit of a trauma at the time. But I think subconsciously it was what I wanted really from the second week in, because I wasn't the guy giving up the evenings and weekends to do work. I was the guy who was sort of like just fleshing out business plans and chatting till 6 a.m. about a new business we could launch with friends and stuff like that. So my heart totally wasn't in it.
Okay. So you always kind of wanted to branch out a bit.
I always wanted to branch out, and I wasn't sure what exactly it was, and I wasn't even sure that I wanted to work in tech. I just knew that I wanted to be sort of master my own destiny, really. And I knew that I wasn't motivated to do stuff for other people. I'm incredibly motivated, but that motivation comes from within. It doesn't come from other people telling me to do stuff.
Right. That's good to recognize that about yourself. I'm kind of the same way. If someone tells me to do something, I initially want to say no. But if I can get myself to do it, I can do things that most people would never, bother doing.
Exactly. And so I knew that I needed that kind of structure, but I had no idea what sector it would be in or what kind of job I would end up doing. And then about a year or two after I left this corporate law firm, I was broke. And so I was super late to get a smartphone, but I finally got a smartphone. And it was the Galaxy S1, an Android. And I went from this really crappy, probably a Nokia, to this Samsung. And it was like, sort of Pulp Fiction where they open the suitcase and it's like gold, like, It was a bit like that when I turned on this phone. I just realized, wow, this is going to change everything about how we consume goods and services. This is economic opportunity of a scale that is almost incomparable with anything that's kind of gone on before in as regards to technological change. I want to learn about this, and I want to be part of this, and I want to help people get goods and services and improve their lives using this amazing piece of technology. So that was really the catalyst, and then I went to a whole bunch of networking events, and one of them was a thing called Launch 48, which is run by UCL. You start a company over the course of a weekend. I met Anthony, who started Park in My House, which then became JustPark. Right. And we were then only a couple of people, and I've been CEO for 2.5 years now.
2.5 years.
Yeah.
And where are you now? For people that don't understand what JustPark is, can you just break it down quite simply?
Of course.
I guess it should be obvious, but...
So, very short history lesson. The business started as Park in My House.
Right.
And Anthony had this idea. He was in San Francisco. He was looking for parking and around a giant stadium. And he saw these driveways. And he was just thinking, this is ridiculous. Like, I want to park there. They would want my money, but I can't park there. Why can't I park there?
Right.
Surely there should be some website that just matches up their supply with my demand.
It sounds like something a 6-year-old would be saying while mommy and daddy are looking around for a place. They'd be like, why don't we park in their house? And you'd be like, shut up. I'm trying to find a place.
Yeah,
it's almost like so obvious, but so not obvious. This capacity.
And I think the 6-year-old thing, I think that's a perfect analogy because it just goes to show how we get older, and then we kind of get a little bit less creative because society says, oh, you can't do that.
Yeah.
So he being an adult then was like, oh, I'm not actually just going to park there. If he'd been a 6-year-old, he probably would have just parked there. But he thought, okay, I'm not going to park there, but I am going to come back home where I have my very serious job waiting for me at Deloitte, a big accountancy firm. And then I'm going to think about maybe quitting my job and building this website. So it was really just this one idea. He was a young guy, I think he was 23, Anthony, when he started this. And he hadn't really had any experience at all of business. He was very interested in technology. His dad's a software engineer. But he didn't know anything about business. And he got this idea out there, and it's really just an idea. And it got massive initial traction. And now, today, there are 17,000 families in the UK making money from their driveway. And they list the space, and people come and go, and the money just drops into their bank account, incredibly easy. But then what we did is we had all this demand. So at that point, we had, say, maybe 400,000 or 500,000 drivers booking these driveways. And of course, these people are also in need of other types of parking in the centre of cities where you don't have driveways. So we built up, say, in London, this kind of donut, all these driveways, but then in zones 1, you don't have driveways. So we need to really fill in this gap. So then we started working with car parks and hotels and became JustPark, and they now are kind of the jam in the donut.
Okay, gotcha. So it started off just the excess capacity of people's houses, and now you've sourced new capacity.
Exactly. So it started off as this peer-to-peer marketplace,
right,
and it's still a very large peer-to-peer marketplace. What we've done is really put a sort of B2C layer on top of this.
Okay. Wow, fascinating. And is London your major market? How does it differ now? You go from different countries. What does it look like in the States? Tell me, what is your...
So London's our biggest city globally, but the platform is able to be used by anyone in the world. So it gets used all over the world as a result. The US is our second biggest market, and we don't really market or promote the service there at all. We've never had an employee in the US, but it's really gratifying that it is getting used. And so, for example, in Boston last year, there was about $40,000 going back into people's pockets, which is kind of a small sum, but then when you add up all of these cities from around the world, it gets to become quite a big long tail. And the interesting question for us strategically is, yes, we can see that this is a service that people love and get value from, but how should we allocate our resources between cities that are already on that curve and cities that are, really just seeing some sort of initial sort of action.
Right. It's tricky to know, like, whether you should put people in the city, if that's going to help or hurt your resources, that kind of thing. Just going back to the sharing economy really quick, what are some of the big takeaways from this book that might not be obvious from people who've, used Airbnb as a seller or as a buyer, or have done some sharing things? Like, what are some things that are really going to, because it's going to rattle the business model of everyone, the fact that this exists in the future. What are some of the things that we should kind of keep an eye out for, whether you work in a corporation or just as a consumer, of things that are going to change?
So let me just explain the structure of the book real brief. So basically, it's split into chapters that relate to all of the different stakeholders in the sharing economy. So there's a chapter called Consumers, which is about how consumers are deriving value from the sharing economy. There's a chapter called Corporates, which is about how corporates are responding. There's one on regulation called Governments, and so on. There's one on investors as well. So there's 6 different chapters. They all look at these different ways into the sharing economy, and it's really reflective of the fact that this is a very, very collaborative economy that is bringing different value to very different sorts of people and also very different challenges to different sorts of people. So it's written such that people can just dive into the book. So say you are a corporate and you're interested in how corporates are going to be challenged and need to engage with these new companies, then you just head straight to the corporate section. So for example, you mentioned that point. What I talk about there is the different ways that big multinational incumbent companies are responding to what is essentially a competitive threat. And there are some sectors that are responding really positively. So, for example, the automotive sector is embracing a lot of these new sharing models.
Okay. BMW,
they invested in 2011 in us. Okay. They have also a service called Drive Now, which is basically car sharing, premium car sharing. Okay. They have a venture capital fund, which is to do with mobility services. This is an example of a business that realizes they just can't keep doing the same old thing forever. Patterns of consumption are changing, and they can't have a huge business just based on selling cars. So what they need to do is they need to sell access to these cars, they need to sell mobility services, and they really need to totally reconceive what they are as a business. But then also there are sectors that really aren't innovating in the same way. So for example, if you look at the accommodation sector, hotels have done very, very little to tap into the new demand for accommodation that sites like Airbnb are really ignited. So I think that's a shame, and I think that's rather short-sighted on their part. The majority of energy from the big hotel groups has really gone into lobbying against the threat, as they see it, of sites like Airbnb. But actually, if I was CEO of Hilton, I'd be saying, hang on a sec. There is a demand, clearly, for this new type of accommodation. Why don't I, in, say, New York City, put together a curated marketplace called Hilton Homes.
Help facilitate it, right?
And there's going to be some beautiful, luxurious homes, and they can be serviced from a nearby Hilton hotel. And instead of selling one bedroom to a businessman for a couple of nights, maybe he's going to take a whole Hilton home and he's going to spend $10,000, $15,000 taking his family to New York City, and he's going to have a different type of experience. So I think that, I think some of these businesses are responding positively, some less so. And in that chapter, I talk about all the different ways that they are responding. There's sort of 4 different strategies, but go read the book to find out more.
That's good. And taxis are another similar piece. I mean, you see in London, the black cabs, protest Uber, and in most cities, they are, holding fast and holding to these licenses. And I mean, I love black cabs. It's something I fell in love with London when I first came here 12, 13 years ago. And I thought it was like my private limousine, and everyone loves a black cabbie, et cetera. But at the same time, when it's 1 a.m. 5 years ago, and these guys are driving past you because they want to go home, you're like, wait a second, this is, this isn't fair. This isn't a free market. And so at the same time, you're like, okay, we need to move forward, and we need to really have a supply and demand marketplace. So it's interesting to see. And then there's the innovator's dilemma. I used to work in banking. We didn't want electronic trading to happen because it was going to make me obsolete. And so you almost fight it without thinking about fighting it. You just ignore it as long as you can, until then one day you either capitulate or get taken over.
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the really challenging things about the sharing economy. It's generally very, very good for consumers, but it can be really bad for some of the service providers. So black cabs is an obvious example. I've lived in a few different places, but I'm very much born and bred Londoner. And for me, as with you, a non-Londoner, black cabs are still so synonymous with London. And I used to get black cabs the whole time when I was coming home late from work, and it was just be a sort of almost like my daily route home, and I really loved it. Like, they have this sort of low-level grumpiness almost that's so invigorating. You get out of a cab, and I've had amazing conversations with black cab drivers, and like as a bunch, they're hardworking, honest, like a great bunch of people. I think have added so much to the fabric of London, and yet they're really expensive. And they don't provide people with value for money, and that the skills they have, like knowing every single back street and taking the knowledge, are kind of ancient skills. And in 10 years' time, they're going to be like, wood carving or, knitting or stuff like that. These are like homely, antiquated skills. And so one of the challenges of the sharing economy for the people working in some of these incumbent industries is, how are they going to adapt? And whereas it's great for us that we can get an Uber home for £6 or something like that when it would have cost 16 quid in a black cab, actually there's a lot of people who are going to be really hit by these new structural changes. They're maybe too old, they're too inflexible, they're too low skill to move across these new platforms.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's something that's going to see how that shakes out, because like you said, it's fascinating how these skills that they had, I mean, the knowledge is an amazing thing. If you're not from London, these cabbies sometimes will spend between 2 and 4 years memorizing the streets. Yep. They've done studies on their brain, and they actually link through like a cerebral cortex piece, the 2 hemispheres of the brain, when they've done like these CT scans. Yeah. So they actually change their physiology by memorizing all this stuff. But, that's just not necessary anymore. And so it's going to be hard to watch this happen. But again, it's the market.
It is a market, and ultimately, this is about efficiency. Yeah. So the sharing economy is adding value because it's finding these efficiencies on both sides of the marketplace. And that's why, really, this is just the start of a huge, huge trend. Because strip it down, and this is a leaner way of consuming and providing services. A good example of that is, say, peer-to-peer finance. If you look at a business like Lending Club, it's now IPO'd recently. It's lending around $300 million a month.
America, right?
America, I think NASDAQ or NYSE. Anyway, it's a US flotation, French CEO, but headquartered in San Francisco. And so they're lending about $300 million a month, which is tiny. Macroeconomically, this is a drop in the ocean of credit around the world. But it's growing very quickly, and it's going to continue to grow because it's ultimately just a more efficient model. So if you look at a bank, they have an operational expense ratio of something like 5 to 7%, whereas these guys are doing it sub 2% and getting lower as they scale that technology. Right. And so in some senses, this is just a maths game. It's the same with JustPark. If you look at the peer-to-peer inventory, that is way cheaper. It's about half the price of parking on street, just because there's so much less demand for it.
Right.
And so, again, it's just a maths game of actually this is just more efficient. And a lot of companies like Lending Club or JustPark or all of these companies in the sharing economy are finding efficiencies.
So it's inevitable at those kind of ratios. I mean,
I think it is
going to be
inevitable, which is why you see so much money going into this sector, billions and billions of dollars. The question is, are these sharing economy businesses going to be really big, or are they going to be colossal? And I think that's really all that's up for grabs. If you look at the macro drivers, they are here to stay, and they are putting people on this, they're keeping these companies on this trajectory. Things like the adoption of social media, increasing smartphone penetration, population growth, urbanization, all of these macro factors that are making sharing economy companies viable are really only going to continue.
Right. Fast forward 20 years, what is the world going to look like as it's so much more shared? Are we going to walk outside and then will there be no cars on the streets? Will it all be on demand? Will every piece of excess inventory being shared? Will be someone in our house when we're at work? I mean, like, what I know you can't predict the future, but what are some of the things that'll be like totally like, oh my gosh, it's now all been made efficient all of a sudden?
Okay, so it'll be absolutely second nature to get a good or service from another person. So you will no longer think of that as a quirky or unusual thing. That will just be part of your daily routine. Right. If you were to buy something from eBay, you would still think from a person on eBay rather than a shop, which is about 25% of their revenue, you would still think of yourself as doing something a little unusual or eccentric. That would just become the norm. For the reason that you just really talked about, the efficiency of these models. And these marketplaces, which is really the core of the sharing economy, are just going to get bigger and more powerful. And again, this comes down to efficiency. And so, if you look at the growth of the marketplace, really ancient invention. I don't know if you ever played Civilization.
No.
So Civilization is like the geekiest game ever. And I'm just going off on a massive
adventure game.
I'm going off on a massive tangent, Brian, because we've got an hour.
That's
okay.
Good, that's good. Let's do it.
So the geeks out there will know that there is a computer game called Civilization for kids that didn't kind of go out too much, like me. And when your civilization is growing, you get various inventions. And one of those inventions is a marketplace. And this is this sort of primitive thing, and people come together in the center of your little town, and it creates commerce. It's great. And so this is a really, really ancient concept. And then these marketplaces got bigger and bigger over time. And that was great, too, because you could have more supply and more demand, and that created efficiencies. So in Europe, for example, the biggest marketplace is Krakow in Poland. And for hundreds of years, people would go there, converge there for miles around. And that was great. Lots of people. And you could
on
go
a river near agricultural lands.
Yeah, it's in a big city. Yeah, there's a river there. Right. Voltiva, so you can converge, and that's great. And you head there with a little pocket of coins, and you want to buy a cow. That's great, because there's going to be 80 people selling cows, and you can find the right cow. Right. And then the internet came along and said, actually, you can have uncapped supply and demand. Screw like this Krakow marketplace that's 400 meters across or whatever it is. You can have billions of people in this marketplace, in this online marketplace. And so that is the ultimate, this is the ultimate underlying phenomenon, that as people become more and more connected, these marketplaces are just going to be absorbing and eating into all the incumbent industries because they are so much more efficient.
Right.
So yeah, that's a taste of the future. I also think, there's going to be some sharing economy losers as well. That's for sure. So particularly on labor marketplaces, it's a really challenging place to be. This is somewhat touching on the black cab market.
Right. They have to re-educate themselves and find new pieces.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of these efficiencies is that you pay as a consumer as little as possible for the services. So, like in Krakow, you're paying as little as possible for the cow that you want. On a labor marketplace, you're paying as little as possible for someone to clean your house or do your dry cleaning or whatever it is. It's great for you as a consumer, but it's pretty challenging if you as a service provider, cleaning or whatever, doing dry cleaning, are charging the very, very floor.
Right.
So
it hopefully makes up. I mean, I talk to every single Uber driver that I sit with, and I always ask them, and they're always happy because they're doing more work. But that's in that sector. That might not be across other sectors because they make up in volume.
Yeah, and I think they are generally very happy now. The question, even with something like Uber, is what regulation is going to stop Uber as a platform exerting disproportionate control over the participants on its marketplace. So even now, if Uber wants to slash prices in a city, it slashes prices.
Yeah.
And you as a driver just have to deal with that.
Yeah.
If Uber brings in a policy or has a policy which says, if you're ill, you don't get paid. Well, this is the reality. If you're ill, you don't get paid. Okay? If your car breaks down, you don't get paid. That's the reality. So life can be quite tough on these sharing economy marketplaces. And it's slightly Darwinian, really. The strongest will survive. And that's just entrepreneurship, really, because what it's doing is it's creating kind of mass entrepreneurship.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me a bit of like the recession when it hit in America. Everybody was upset and they had to find new jobs. But in America, they're very good at cutting workforces and getting rid of, people that aren't performing, and they re-educate themselves. And now it's recovered as an economy much faster than a lot of the European economies that, say, have employment contracts, and they're much more about a socialist mind frame. So I guess it is all about finding the efficiency and finding as a person what you should be doing. Maybe it's not in these old service sectors. I don't know. It's a little harsh too.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about fundraising, because this is one of the fascinating parts of your story. You, JustPark got funding from Index Ventures last year. Is that right? 2014?
Yep.
Index, huge company. We have one of their partners here talking about taking Just Eat public. I would say it's the marquee VC firm in London, one of the, right? I mean, if you get funding from Index, Saul Klein, you're in the know. You're with a lot of other great companies that have also been funded by there. A lot of companies that would be their dream, and then they would go continue building their company.
Yep.
You decided to go tap the crowdfunding market, and I wanted to know why you did it. Was it difficult for Index to even entertain that idea? You really are trailblazing in this sense, because usually people do it the other way around, or at least that's what the public thinks.
Yeah.
We think of the Kickstarter to start a movie or something, and we don't really understand crowdfunding, but you did it after the fact. Can you just break down that whole thought process?
Sure. Okay. So it started off as a kind of plan B. I was walking home one night and I was thinking, okay, we're having all these conversations with all of these VCs. But as everyone knows, VCs can kind of string out conversations, they find out more, but having interest and having nice meetings and this kind of thing with VCs is very different to getting to the point where they write your check.
Right.
And so
hard enough running a company, let alone fundraising while you're running the company, let alone being let on.
Let alone writing,
right,
and writing a book. Don't forget that.
Jeez. Right, and writing a book too.
Yeah. And so I was walking home thinking, well, maybe what if they're just leading us on a kind of merry dance and these deals just don't come together? Well, we need a backup. So maybe we should look into crowdfunding, because we could see that lots of companies were doing it. I knew that JustPark was solving a common problem. It was well understood. It had a pretty significant user base then of about 400,000 or 500,000 people. So I was thinking, okay, let's look into this as a backup plan. How are we going to work out if this is a viable backup plan or not to raise money from a VC? Why don't we just ask them? So I remember emailing Anthony. No, I picked up the phone. I was like, hey, why don't we just ask our customers if they want to do an equity crowdfunding and work out if it's a backup option or not? So he said, yeah, okay, that sounds like a pretty sensible idea. Let's do it tomorrow. So got to work tomorrow, and I drafted an email which basically said, we might be doing equity crowdfunding. This isn't an offer to subscribe for shares in the event, blah, blah, blah. And it had some sort of pretty...
Former lawyer.
Former lawyer. Hopefully not breaking too many financial regulations. So we got this email out, and it linked to a Google form. And it was incredibly simple. It was just, what's your name? How much would you be interested in invest? Subject to, full terms of the deal, blah, blah, blah. We didn't know what to expect. I had very low expectations personally. We got it out, and the response was just unbelievable. So we had hundreds and hundreds of emails back. We had hundreds of small pledges, and those pledges cumulatively added up to more than £500,000 from 5% of our user base.
Okay, so you only...